Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for a very Rockwell Christmas. Enjoy Rockwell's depictions of the humorous and heartwarming aspects of people coming together for the holidays. Painted over several decades, Rockwell's Christmas images capture universal scenes of celebration and joy and have helped to shape American ideas about, quote, the most wonderful time of the year. And so this presentation is led by art historian Jane Oneail, who's the owner of Culturally Curious. Jane holds a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from Harvard University's Graduate School of Education. Jane is a New Hampshire native and has worked at some of her state's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she served as executive director, as well as the Currier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. And again, want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Library for sponsoring today's event. So all 122 of us, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Jane for joining us this morning. And Jane, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Robert, and a round of applause to everybody who's joining us. I'm just so flattered and humbled that you're taking time out of your day today to spend it with me and learn a little bit more about Norman Rockwell and enjoy these wonderful images of the seasons. So we're starting off with an adorable child here sticking his face through the wreath. He's all smiles and goofiness, and he's got that red hair that Norman Rockwell just loves. He never met a redhead he didn't love. So this sort of sets the tone for today. This is a really sort of fun, lighthearted program. We looked at Norman Rockwell the last time we were together, but those were images of World War II, sort of a heavier subject. But when it comes to Christmas, Norman Rockwell, I think, is sort of at his very best. So let me give you a sense in terms of how we'll move through the material today. We're going to start off with the briefest of introductions to Norman Rockwell. We'll turn our attention to Christmas and how it's been celebrated in the United States. Give us a sense too in terms of what Norman Rockwell was sort of basing his artwork on, what it was inspired by. And then I've structured the rest of the program sort of in the order of our experience of the holidays. First, it starts getting cold. Then we start thinking about all of our favorite winter traditions. Maybe that's when you're, pulling out family heirlooms as decorations for around the house. And then all of the prep work that goes into the holidays. The decorating, the shopping, the baking. Norman Rockwell gives us a lot of that. And then we begin to fantasize. There's the anticipation, what's going to be under the tree. So for so many of us, we can hardly wait. And then it's the reunions. It's getting together. It's reconnecting with the people that you love. Norman Rockwell depicts that so well. We celebrate, and then we are wiped out at the end. So Norman Rockwell gives some pretty funny images of that as well. So over here on the right, we've got a little image here that kind of brings it all together. We've got a church, we've got a Santa, we've got a Christmas tree and people dancing around it. We'll be seeing a lot of celebrating over the next hour, but let's get started with our introduction to Norman Rockwell. Very brief introduction. So I'm sure most of you know that Norman Rockwell was a prolific contributor to the covers of the Saturday Evening Post for almost a span of about 50 years. Now, he was born just before the turn of the century, and he lived well into the era of disco, as I like to say. We think of him as being really one of the most beloved artists or illustrators of the 20th century. Really the only difference between being an artist and an illustrator is who you're producing your artwork for, whether it's fine art for like a gallery or museum setting, or if it was commissioned work that was used for commercial purposes. So most of his work was commissioned for commercial purposes, like this work over here for the Saturday Evening Post, his famous triple self-portrait, which I think gives you a little clue into his sense of humor, and in this case, very self-deprecating, because we can see him first as an artist artist at work sitting at his easel. We see him from behind. The second version, we see his reflection in the mirror, what he's looking at in order to create a self-portrait. And his reflection certainly looks kind of goofy. He looks a little bit like a pencil neck geek, and he's also wearing these glasses which obscure his eyeballs. And then finally, the third self-portrait in his triple self-portrait is the portrait that he is painting. And notice that he makes himself look quite debonair here. He even like the angle of his pipe has completely changed here too, but of course we can see his eyes crystal clear, and he's looking quite dashing. So when it comes to Norman Rockwell, we think of him as having this outsized role in American culture because he was illustrating for the cover of the Saturday Evening Post for so long. He really helped to reflect and define what the American middle class looked like. And what we'll see today is that he was helping to define the way we thought of the holidays and how we celebrated the holidays. I think these two images right here give us a good preview in terms of what that looks like. Of course, this image over here on the left is from his famous For Freedom series from 1943. And it's an image that's supposed to sort of point to the fact that Americans don't have to worry about where their next meal is coming from. It's called The Freedom from Want, but it is a sort of this classic depiction of a Thanksgiving meal, multi-generational in a sort of a prosperous middle-class household, very comfortable, but it's also about this family gathering. And I think it really helps to establish the way we think a Thanksgiving meal should look. And to the same extent, we see a wonderful depiction of Santa over here on the right. He's smiling, he's jovial, he's pink-cheeked. Even my little 2-year-old who wandered over to my computer the other day saw this image and immediately just lit up. She's like, Santa. He makes these very recognizable, very appealing images that we just sort of are attracted to. Now, let's turn our attention briefly to the history of Christmas in American culture. And this is going to be the briefest of overviews, but just to give us a sense in terms of what Christmas looked like in the 19th century leading into the 20th century. So Christmas in American culture is really sort of defined by two texts, and one of them is not even an American text, but the first over here on the left is Clement Moore's Night Before Christmas from 1823. Many of you probably know it by heart. I know all of my in-laws do. On Christmas morning, they actually recite it from memory, and that gives us a good sense of what Santa's midnight ride really looks like, and what he is like as an individual, you know, a small jolly elf. And it sort of establishes who this character of Santa is. Now, we also have Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol that's published in 1847, which helps to expand this notion of what Christmas is. It isn't just gift giving within your family, it's this notion of being charitable at this particular time of year, sort of an expansive notion of gratitude and seasonal giving. And so really before these texts existed, there was no unified way of celebrating the Christmas holiday in America. Believe it or not, for many people, it was just a drinking holiday. I mentioned this the other night in one of my programs, and somebody responded with, it's still a drinking holiday, but it used to be sort of like a St. Patrick's Day for a lot of people. So it wasn't until 1870 that Christmas became a federal holiday in the United States. And then there became a more unified way of celebrating. Now, what did Santa look like along the way? There's a late 19th century cartoonist named Thomas Nash, and his depictions of Santa were honestly, in my opinion, a little bit creepy. We haven't quite arrived at our like 20th century Coca-Cola version of Santa. We can see he's sort of related to Clement Moore's idea of like a small jolly elf, but there are some images that look a little eerie to me. I mean, if I was one of these children waking up and seeing this guy in the fireplace, I think I'd be screaming rather than smiling. I mentioned the Coca-Cola Santa, and that's because for so many, there's this misconception that it was Norman Rockwell who actually established the Coca-Cola Santa. It was in fact another artist. The Coca-Cola Santa, I think, was invented in like the early 1930s, and the artist's name is Haddon Sundblom. So we'll see that Norman Rockwell was certainly painting Santa before that, and maybe his images sort of influenced what Sundblom was doing, but I think there was some cross-pollination each way. Now, I want to give you a sense in terms of what Norman Rockwell does with his Christmas images that make them so special. This, the image that I have on the screen here right now is not an image by Norman Rockwell. This is one of his colleagues from the Saturday Evening Post. His name is Stefan Dehanos. This is from 1952. And this is, I think, a very relatable image of the holidays. Most of us might be in this phase of holiday shopping where we are, we are task driven. We're buying the specific gifts for specific people. We're waiting in lines, and we're sort of burdened by the responsibilities and obligations. This is a group of people, obviously, who've done their shopping and they are waiting at the bus, and not one of them looks happy, right? This is an image about holiday frustrations, and they certainly exist, but that is not the world that Norman Rockwell wants to give us. He wants to give us the magic through and through. I love this image here from the 1950s. This is probably for a holiday card, but in this picture, we can see two really angelic looking children who've already opened their Christmas presents, and they're sitting here on this ottoman with their hands clasped sort of solemnly and leaning forward as though they're listening to a story from grandma or grandpa. Even the dog looks kind of attentive here. So he's giving us a different look and reminding us about what is most precious, what is most sacred about this time of year. Now, I use the word sacred, and I think it makes sense to just sort of clarify where Norman Rockwell stood when it came to the religious aspect of the holiday. Every now and then you see him bringing in some of the religious stories related to Christmas, but that's not his primary focus. He wasn't necessarily a very religious person, so it's a little bit tangential when it comes to his images, but we do see him touching on religious subject matter with these two images from the 1950s. This one over here, where we see two children dressed up for a nativity play, is simply called The Rehearsal. And in this case, we understand that they're probably rehearsing for the play, but the way they're looking at each other, this little flirtation that's happening, we get the sense that they're rehearsing for becoming teenagers, becoming more like young adults who would be much more interested in engaging with each other in a flirtatious way. Over here on the right, we have a little choir boy singing. And of course, that would be in a church setting. And we imagine choirs, creating a sort of heavenly sound. But the way Norman Rockwell depicted this little boy, I just imagined his voice like breaking and cracking and squeaking. I think it's that huge mouth and the big ears. He's very earnest and he's fully invested in this music, but somehow I think that this is more of a joke than anything else. So when it comes to religion, when it comes to the reason for the season, for Norman Rockwell, it always just came back to the golden rule. This is his famous painting from 1961, where he outlines, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." And notice in this painting, he's trying to portray as many faith traditions as possible, because he understood this notion as being central, foundational to all the great religions in the world. And so this is the mantra that he really lived his life by as much as he could. So this is a good opportunity for us to just transition to this next section, getting into Norman Rockwell's images about this special time of year. We're going to get started with just the change in weather. It's starting to get cold. I'm up in New Hampshire right now, and it is freezing here. I've got many, many layers on. So for many people, as the seasons change, as it's getting darker and darker, people get grumpier, don't they? It's hard to keep your mood sort of buoyed. And so for this calendar, Norman Rockwell produced a series of images of these two old friends that bundle up and go and visit each other at each other's houses and sort of entertain each other and are entertained by each other despite the grumpiness. So it's a reminder that that even though this is like a dark time of year for a lot of people, that coming together can really sort of lighten the mood. And Norman Rockwell is all about lightening the mood. Look at this image of winter that he's produced here. It's called Expert Salesman from 1962. And of course, what's happening here, our expert salesman is able to sell an icebox to Eskimos. You've got to find the joy, even if the days are short and the nights are long. But Norman Rockwell also gives us a lot of great images of winter sports and winter activities, getting outside and enjoying the snow as much as you can. So 2 images of sledding here. And I've set this up so that you can see that Norman Rockwell comes up with an original idea, and then sometimes decades later, he returns to it and sort of modifies it, but revisits the theme. So over here, we have Young Love Sledding from 1949. And on the right, we have Adirondack Winter from 1974. So a big chunk of time between these 2 images, but there's a lot in common here, of course. I am very partial to Young Love because of the way he's kind of rendered this hillscape over here with the farm at the top of the hill, the sweetness in these children's faces as they are rushing down this hill. I think she's sort of paralyzed with fear. He's having a better time, but the scarves flying back, this awesome use of the white space, really the whiteness of the page here in order to tell the story of wintertime activities. And we see even more terror over here, more dogs as well, playing along, having the time of your lives. There's so much thrill when it comes to, so many thrills coming to, when it comes to sledding and having fun in the snow. We see more thrills on the ice over here. We have a cover of the Saturday Evening Post from 1920, where we see a lovely young girl who has fallen on the ice, fallen in her skates. And there's a young boy, probably her age or maybe just a little bit younger, who's doing his best to try and heave her up. He doesn't make it look like it's the easiest thing. And she's being pretty good natured about it. It's as though Norman Rockwell took that exact same model and gave her a more appropriate, more handsome, more desirable skating partner over here for an image that he created for Red Cross magazine in the exact same year. So we get a sense of sort of the pitfalls and the joys of ice skating with these 2 images here. But Norman Rockwell always wants to go for the laughs. And so here we have Grandpa ice skating from 1948, and he sure looks like he is having the time of his life. We've got this sweet sort of country setting here in the background with some smoke coming out of the chimney. Grandpa's out on this frozen pond with his grandson and the dog, and he's literally skating in figure 8s, kicking his skate up behind him. He's adopted this great pose here, a huge smile on his face. And I think it brings a smile to most people who are looking at it. So we're sort of getting acclimated to this time of year. It's time to start thinking about traditions. And traditions were pretty important to Norman Rockwell because he was sort of steeped in the tradition of Charles Dickens. His father read him Dickens when he was a young boy. And I believe he would spend a lot of time drawing and sketching in response to what he was listening to from his father. So we've got this great image here from 1937, sort of inspired by characters from Dickens, not necessarily exact characters from the book, but they're spilling out of this life-size book here, sort of introducing themselves to you. And Norman Rockwell revisits several of these characters for covers of the Saturday Evening Post. So for example, we've got Bob Cratchit and Tiny Tim over here. They are transformed into this post cover that we see on the right, along with the text, "God bless us, everyone." This is from 1934. And So we see this similar pose, Tiny Tim up on his father's shoulder. He's got the same familiar crutch in and the scarf around his head in both of these images. Bob Cratchit's poverty, I think, is really emphasized over here with the patchwork pants and these shoes that are just absolutely falling apart on his feet. But look at the smiles on their faces. Even though they are poor in material possessions, they are, of course, very rich in the love and appreciation and respect in their lives. So this pose is probably something that Norman Rockwell came across in various editions of A Christmas Carol, perhaps editions, an edition that he owned as a young boy. So so that was something that he sort of appropriated and updated for his own purposes. If we go back to that 1937 cover, we can also see this kind of flirtatious couple. They look like maybe they're from a tavern type setting. She looks like a waitress. He's kind of sneaking up behind her for a kiss. And of course, we see something similar in this work over here on the right. This is called Colonial Couple Under a Mistletoe from 1936. And now we see them from behind, or I'm sorry, in profile. She is leaning back into that kiss. This is in no way a surprise. She is there for it. He's holding the mistletoe over her head and he's pursed his lips ready to come in for a smooch. I think this is Norman Rockwell making a little bit of a naughty joke with the placement of the hat here, but there's all these wonderful details in terms of their costume, even just like the faintest suggestion of snow on his boots and on the edge of his cape. It's a lovely scene of merrymaking. Now, one more image that was probably inspired by Charles Dickens is this image over here of this couple dancing. This is from 1928, and it's simply called Colonial Couple Dancing, but we can see in the frontispiece of this edition of the Christmas Carol, there's the depiction of Ebenezer Scrooge's former boss, who was a plump and a happy man. He's dancing at his Christmas celebration. And I think you get sort of a similar feeling from this image that Rockwell produced over here on the right. So even though they're a rather plump couple, they are very light on their feet. They're having the best time dancing around and connecting with each other in this moment. So when it comes to Christmas and Christmas traditions, I think that carols play a huge role in that for so many of us. These songs are so evocative. The words just inspire so many memories for us. And so Norman Rockwell reaches back into that with this image of a trio performing in sort of like Victorian London, if I'm going to guess at the setting here. So there's all these great details of their costumes, of their instruments, of the scarf around this little boy's face. But I also think there might be the faintest hint of humor here as well, because there's something about the way this man's chin is sort of going off to the side, this boy with his mouth wide open. It reminds me of the choir boy that we saw before. Maybe they're just a little bit off key, but you could almost imagine the beautiful music that they could be making here. So our last traditional image that I wanted to share with you is the image of the Jolly Coachman. And this was on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post, actually in the year 1929. So this is just a month or so after the stock market crash. The country is in this very dark place. We're heading into a Great Depression, and Norman Rockwell is tasked with creating a cheerful image to buoy people's spirits. And I think you can see he really hit the mark with something like this. It's not Santa, but it's pretty darn close. This would be the kind of man who would drive a horse-drawn sleigh, right? And here he's got the huge Santa-like belly. This is a pear-shaped man, if ever there was one. He's smiling out at us. He's so engaging, and he's got this magnificent blue coat with all of these golden buttons here. So, so there is a little bit of joy and cheer in an image like this at a particularly dark time for most Americans. So now that we have this sense of tradition, let's think a little bit about preparation. Maybe many of you that are on the Zoom today are also in this moment of preparation as you're getting ready for the holidays. You're thinking about your tree and the shopping and the decorations, all of it. It can be a little overwhelming, but Norman Rockwell never really wants to frame it as anything too negative. So we'll see how he sort of keeps it light along the way. All right. So I think preparation for most of us starts off with getting the tree, and going all the way back to 1920 for this cover of the Country Gentleman magazine. Norman Rockwell shows us two little boys who are out in the snow, out in the wilderness, who go out to cut down their family's Christmas tree, and they're young boys. You can see that they're proceeding home with this real sense of accomplishment in what they've done. You know, they've used an adult's tool here to chop down this tree, and so they're striding home, sort of chasing the light at the end of the day in order to bring their tree home and get it all set up. So there's a real sense of purpose in the way that they're moving here. You even have this sense of forward momentum with their bodies leading forward, the strands of clouds sort of extending the shape of the axe in this direction. And even the dog looks like he has a real purpose here. Now, Norman Rockwell revisits the same motif decades later in the 1950s, but it's a really different attitude, isn't it? Instead of striding forward, it's this overwhelming confidence that these two boys, who are now sort of leaning back on their haunches. It still floors me that there was ever a time when scrawny trees were all the rage, but apparently it was in the 1950s. So you really don't need as much effort to cut down a tree that looks like this. So there's a lot of confidence here, and even more dogs. I guess Norman Rockwell realizes to punch up any of his images, just add a few more dogs. So here they are heading back home to get this tree all set up. Here is another scrawny tree from the 1950s. This is simply called Trimming the Tree. This was a Hallmark card. And we can sort of contrast this very scrawny, sort of asymmetrical tree here with the rather plump, portly figure of this husband over here up on the ladder, just trying to get the star up there perfectly. Now you can tell that his wife isn't at all pleased with him balancing precariously up here. So she's trying to provide this kind of counterbalance. And there's a look of let's say frustration on her face. Just to add to the chaos of the scene, we have two dogs and a cat racing around here. There's broken ornaments on the ground. There's a full-scale chaotic scene unfolding as they're trimming the tree. Now, Norman Rockwell updates this motif in the early 1970s with another tree trimming scene for the Franklin Mint. And now it's all love and family. And I'm much more satisfied because it's a much fuller tree too. So this is a scene about family connection. And I just love how he's using these extended arms between father and son who are handing off an ornament here. It sort of functions as like a little bit of a garland on the tree here as well. So for the most part, he's focusing on the joy, the connection, the happiness. Now, preparation is also about shopping. And I think when most people think of Norman Rockwell's iconic depiction of Stockbridge, Massachusetts, this 8-foot-long panoramic view of the very quaint downtown that we see here from 1967, they don't automatically associate it with shopping, but that's what this picture is of. It's the holidays. If you have really good eyes, there's little Christmas trees and wreaths throughout this image over here, a lot of Christmas lights. And the reason there's all these people on the sidewalks is because it's the holidays and it's time to buy some presents. So right here in the foreground, there's a trio of people heading home with packages under their arms. We even have a car driving in from the left with a tree on top. I was giving this program not too long ago, and somebody noticed that the Red Line Inn is completely dark here. I haven't investigated yet as to why, but of course, it's still there today. And it's such a quaint, wonderful old structure if you ever have the chance to visit it. So shopping is a focus, and Norman Rockwell gives us a sweet depiction of this grandfather doing some holiday shopping in 1916. He's already made a few purchases tucked into his pocket over here. And it looks as though right before he's left, he's been tempted to try on a Santa hat and a Santa beard. We can see he's taken off his own hat and gloves here. And the sales girl is smiling at him, holding up a little Santa and a mirror, showing him just how much he looks like Santa in this moment. And you can tell he's getting a kick out of the idea that he's really playing that role too. Now, notice our shop girl is smiling. She's got the little pencil stuck in her hair too. This next shop girl I'm going to show you is in a very different place. Now we're moving from 1916 to 1947. This is such a great image. This is called Sales Girl Christmas Eve. And if you have good eyes, she's wearing a little pin on her chest and it's a watch. And so you can see that it's just after 5 o'clock on Christmas Eve. The store has been destroyed and she is absolutely wiped out here. The holiday shoppers can really take a lot out of you. So she is looking as ragged as these like Raggedy Ann dolls that are all around her. She's sliding down the wall. She's kicked off her shoes. She's stretching out her toes. Don't you get sort of sympathy foot pain as you look at an image like this? There's just something so comical and so relatable about the expression on her face. Here's the photograph that Norman Rockwell took as inspiration for this work. Now, he had gone to Marshall Fields in Chicago seeking out an actual sales girl to use as a model. He wasn't really satisfied with anybody that he met there. Then he went out to lunch at a diner, and apparently the waitress at the diner he thought just really fit the bill. So I remember after learning that, looking back at her with the pencil in her hair and this thick book in front of her, I was like, yeah, she really feels like a diner waitress. But it's such a magnificent image too. One of the more sort of sour images on the holiday, but still, I feel like it's infused with some good humor here as well. All right, so preparation oftentimes for Norman Rockwell is spelled out in terms of what Santa has to prepare for. So there's a lot of great Santa images here, and of course the Santa images sort of mirror or echo what the American family is going through as well. So here we have Santa reading his mail, and it's of course the reverse. What American families are doing is they're asking their kids to write these letters. So here is Santa preparing for the holiday by reading all of this mail from the good boys and girls of America. And he's sitting here at this antique desk dressed all in red. He's got a little halo. He's connecting his quill to his brain here, and he's ready to write down, take notes on all of these requests from all of these boys and girls. Now, Santa, in some cases, is concerned about financials, just like any good parent. And so over here, Santa is actually wearing like a little accountant's visor and holding an expense book, sort of measuring his financial capability against all of the wishes of these good boys and girls that he's thinking of, who appear as visions behind him in this cover over here on the left. On the right, he's still wearing that little visor, and he's updating this giant ledger of the good boys and the good girls here, looking really friendly, really approachable, right? A jovial character. Now, I've always really loved this image here. It's really sort of a different image for Norman Rockwell in general, where Santa sort of appears as like this mystical figure in the background, almost like a mountain. And in it, he is making notes. He's making his list, he's checking it twice. And it seems as though this little guy in the foreground, he's just been chopping wood with this axe, and he's carrying in all of this firewood very dutifully, acting like a good boy. And you could just imagine him thinking, I hope Santa can see me now because I'm being so good. And of course, in fact, Santa, looming larger than life, is always there, always watching. more preparation work from Santa. He has to start thinking about where he's going to go on Christmas Eve and whose houses he's going to visit. So here he is with his book of good boys over here, of good boys and girls, but he's got his halo in both of these scenes. This one's from 1926, this one's from the 1950s. And we can see, little variations on his costume, but nothing major here. I love the expression of joy he has as he's looking through his telescope, presumably checking in on the kids of the world. Over here, he's using a magnifying glass to really get a sense of where he needs to go on Christmas Eve. Now, we've seen some various depictions of Santa, but we haven't seen him like this yet. This is 1939. Here we are sort of coming out of the Great Depression. Look at how massive this Santa is. This is an apple-shaped body, if ever there was one. He is absolutely enormous. He's this big red presence here sitting on top of a ladder with this tiny little book of extra good boys and girls. And he's using this giant map of the earth to trace his path, his planned path for Christmas Eve. And I love how he's using this red ribbon to outline that path there for us. It's a beautiful picture, but I really get a kick out of how enormous Santa is here. Now, Santa has a really important job that we haven't touched on yet, which is, of course, getting all of these presents ready. Occasionally, he sleeps on the job, and we can see that the elves have to kick it into high gear to finish up where Santa left off. Sometimes there's even a rush order, so the elves are painting things, they're putting things into Santa's sack over here. They're very industrious little beings, and thank goodness they're there to help Santa, who just can't seem to keep his eyes open, whether it's in the 1920s or the 1950s over here. So we'll end our section on preparation with just one last image where this could be Santa, this could be a grandpa, right? We're not really sure if we're in Santa's workshop or in somebody's wood shop, but we definitely see an older man here with a big white beard who is clearly having fun making toys, and in this moment is just delighted by what he has created here. So it sort of humanizes Santa, literally kind of brings him home in this moment. So once we get all of this work done, now we can go into sort of fantasy land, which is all about anticipation, wondering, what are we going to see under the tree? If you're a child, you always wonder, are you going to see Santa? And Norman Rockwell was so good about capturing these kind of special wishes and dreams of children that I think sometimes we forget about as we get older. So of course, nobody forgets about the desire for toys. And so in this early picture from Norman Rockwell from 1920, we can see children looking in at toys through a store window. We see the word toy up above. And then of course, everything that's in yellow here is really like a silhouette of what they're looking at. And we see the joy, the surprise, the anticipation in the faces of these children as they imagine receiving presents that look like this. One of my favorite images from this whole presentation is this one here called The Jolly Postman from 1949. Here we see a mailman really getting a kick out of how suddenly popular he is with the children of the neighborhood, because we can see that he has so many holiday packages and Christmas cards to deliver. They are chasing him as though he is Santa himself. And of course, these days, this would be the Amazon Prime guy, right, in our lives. So it feels pretty good to have this newfound level of popularity. I love this image. Now, anticipation is also about being able to tell Santa exactly what you'd like. And Norman Rockwell depicts these really angelic looking children doing just that. In 1927, we have a humongous over life-size Santa face, joyful, sort of pink cheek, illuminated as though he's sitting by a fire. And he is sort of supernatural. He's like otherworldly because this child he can hold on his fingertips. And it's as innocent as you could imagine. A little boy in white pajamas with his hands earnestly clasped behind his back, presumably asking Santa for all that his heart desires. And Santa is delighted to hear it and presumably delighted to deliver. Over here, we have two children from the 1950s. So decades later, same pajamas, but still looking so innocent, so sweet. And Santa is now sort of in their world, on their scale, leaning in to hear their wishes, their Christmas dreams. And of course, those items are circling around them in this kind of imaginary realm here. Now, one last very sweet child in white pajamas. I don't know if it gets any sweeter than this. This is simply called A Christmas Prayer. It's a 1970s Hallmark card. And this little kid just looks like an absolute angel, doesn't he? He's saying his prayers at the end of his bed. He's got this homemade quilt here, and he's got his stocking pinned to the end of his bed. It doesn't get sweeter than this. Now, anticipation means that sometimes it's just really hard to go to sleep at night and stay in bed. So here we've got a little guy who's crept out of his bed. He's halfway down the stairs, and he sees Santa and his mom. Now, I'm not sure which came first. I saw Mommy kissing Santa Claus or this image here, which is called Christmas Surprise from 1954. But we see the same idea as in the famous carol. Santa leaning forward, giving mom a smooch, and she is just so delighted. She's dropping all the packages in her arms. This sort of reminds me of that colonial couple that we saw before. Here is Norman Rockwell's photograph of his models in preparation for this image over here. Such a great, sweet scene. Now, other children, when they get out of bed, they can make it all the way downstairs, and they are looking for an opportunity to see Santa himself. I absolutely love this image over here on the left. It's called Is He Coming from 1920. And we see two little kids. They're peeking into the fireplace up the chimney. And the way this little one here is turned back towards us, looking directly at us, it sort of transforms us, the viewer, into another child. We're there. We're on this expedition to find Santa. We haven't discovered the kids out of bed. We are there and sharing in the magic with them. We have the same idea sort of updated over here on the right, but now it's a solitary child up past their bedtime with the dog just peeking up the chimney over here. I love this other image of a child who's gotten out of bed before he should. He's carrying his alarm clock. It's 5 a.m. Somehow, even though this image is from the 1950s, he's carrying a candlestick, but we see this absolutely fantastic expression on his face and obviously the bedhead. And so we can imagine what he's seeing in this moment. Is he surprised at like all of the presents under the tree? Or maybe, just maybe, he stumbled upon Santa making this delivery here. We know some kids refuse to go to bed unless they get the chance to see Santa. So Norman Rockwell depicts this several times throughout his career. Early on, the little girl who has fallen asleep in the armchair with her dog. Santa is delighted to see her as he's dropping off gifts. Now in the over here in the 1950s, we've got two little kids in their white pajamas who've just passed out here. Santa is sort of surprised to find them, and the elves are shushing everybody just to make sure that they don't get woken up, and they sure are cute. Now, believe it or not, there's a real scandal around this next image here. A scandal so bad that Norman Rockwell actually never painted another Christmas cover for the Saturday Evening Post after this one. This is from 1956, and it's called The Discovery. So we can see a little boy who has been going through his father's dresser drawers in the middle of the day here, and he has found a brown box that was tied up with string. And sort of like on Christmas morning, he's opened up this box, and what does he find? a Santa suit. So there's Santa's clothes over here, Santa hat with an attached beard that is upside down, and he's holding that beard in his hand, looking directly out at us with shock and surprise at discovering this suit and the accompanying revelation of who Santa might actually be. Now, covering the Santa suit here are all of these little white dots, and those are, of course, mothballs. Every time I say the word mothballs, I can smell them. But for Norman Rockwell, it's such a great kind of choice here because he is in so many ways echoing the experience of Christmas morning with opening up a package, and all of the little white stuff on the floor here sort of reminds me of like freshly fallen snow. Of course, putting this on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post prompted a lot of uncomfortable conversations in households across America. And so there was a lot of angry mail to the Saturday Evening Post, which is probably what got Rockwell into some hot water there. And I don't know if it was his decision or the Post decision not to return to this subject afterwards. Here is a picture of the little model that was hired for this particular assignment. Norman Rockwell bought him the pajamas, gave them to the little boy, and said to his mother, make sure he sleeps in these for a week. Don't wash them, don't iron them. I want these to look like very well-used pajamas here. And I think he just nails it over here in the finished work. So just a few more images of anticipation. In this case, we see another image of discovery. We have a department store Santa who is done for the day, heading home on the subway, and he's kind of tucked the elements of his Santa suit into his pocket here. He just wants to ride, unnoticed. This is also called a reindeer's day off. But of course, a little boy who's been shopping at that same department store is doing a big double take now, recognizing Santa out of his element. So one final scene of anticipation, and this is such a good one. It's a lot like the discovery that we saw before. This is for a Hallmark card. We can see a very sort of scrawny looking dad who is donning a Santa suit, shoving a giant pillow in the belly, with mom on her knees trying to sew him into this suit. And of course, there's a mirror on the back wall where we see a reflection. The little girl has just walked into the room and her mouth is wide open. So the expressions on the faces of these parents, I just find so funny. They know they've been busted, and that maybe the illusion of Santa has been destroyed for this little one here. So let's turn our attention now to reunion. And this is really where Norman Rockwell shines. He knows that people coming together is really the best part of the holidays. So we have a young woman who has just taken the train that we see at the top of the composition, and now she is on a horse-drawn sleigh heading home to see her family. She's got a stack of presents on her lap. They are flying here. Notice the dog with his ears flapping back in the wind. And this man driving the sleigh reminds me so much of our jolly coachman from 20 years earlier, back in 1929. But she's heading home, and we all know that feeling of just dying to see your loved ones. These reunions are oftentimes an opportunity for grandparents to reconnect with their grandkids. So over here on the left, we have a grandfather sort of spinning a yarn. This is called the story of Christmas. The grandfather is sort of sainted here with this wreath creating a halo behind his head, sitting in front of the fire with these two sweet little ones, and really just appreciating their beauty and their innocence, their youth over here. And then this picture on the right is called The Present from 1936. Grandpa's invited this little guy to start looking through his pockets for the present. And we know that in just a moment, he's going to discover that little puppy and be the happiest kid on earth. Now, sometimes grandpas, which are clearly a favorite subject for Norman Rockwell, or at least for his editors, sometimes they're the butt of the jokes. This grandpa is coming to visit for Christmas. His grandson has made a sort of goofy looking rendition of him as a snowman, and he's kind of cowering behind it. He doesn't know how grandpa's going to react, but this grandpa gets a real kick out of it. The grandfather over here on the right, carrying all of these presents, getting, completely ready for Christmas. Well, he's caught up in a snowdrift here. Maybe something's fallen off the roof of the house, but he's been knocked down and all of the presents have been knocked to the ground as well. So once again, Norman Rockwell's making great use of all of this white space on the canvas in order to just have these elements of the toys and the figure kind of sticking out. Now, this is another motif that he borrowed from earlier on in his career. In December 1913, for Boys Life magazine, he shows a Santa with essentially the exact same face who's fallen to the ground, packages in the snow, but he's being helped up by these Boy Scouts, very dutiful Boy Scouts. Reunions are, like I said, the bread and butter of Norman Rockwell's artwork. And sometimes you don't even have to see people coming together. It's just that look of anticipation in people's faces. I love this image from 1951, where it's a beautiful sort of quintessential Christmas. I love these tiny branches extending out in the foreground with just a dusting of snow on them. The sweet, innocent faces in the window looking out with delight at whoever's coming down the walkway. But this sort of spoils it a little bit. This is actually an ad for Plymouth Automobiles. So they might not be looking at family members coming in. Maybe they're just looking at the new car in the driveway. This next image, which I know is a favorite for so many people, called Merry Christmas, Grandma, also from 1951, is also another ad for Plymouth Automobiles. They're there to visit Grandma because they've got a great car to bring them, right? So it's a beautiful young family with this sweet little kid in his red snowsuit here. They all have their Christmas packages. Grandma's house is all decked out. I mean, this is so idealized. This is the kind of Christmas that I think so many of us fantasize about. And there's just something so funny and endearing about this little kid screaming. I think he became a favorite ornament for a lot of people over the years. Norman Rockwell really nails this Christmas homecoming, this reunion here, at least in my eyes. There is nothing like this embrace between mom and daughter. It really resonates with me in particular. We can see here's the photograph that he used of his models. And I mean, he nails it. It's like an exact copy of what he took with his camera. So in this case, this is an ad that he created for Schaefer pens. And so, mom and daughter are happy to see each other. Maybe there's a little bit of tension between the son-in-law or the boyfriend, but he's going to smooth everything over with the perfect gift of a pen. We're going to see a few more pens along the way. This is Norman Rockwell's Christmas Homecoming from 1948. And I think it's such an awesome image because it really emphasizes what is most important around this time of year. It's not the presents, it's not the decorations, although there's a little bit of that here. It's all about the human connection. It's reconnecting with all of the most important people in your lives, your friends, your family. And Norman Rockwell gives us this young man who is coming home. His entire family is on their feet, smiling, celebrating his return. He's getting this wonderful bear hug from his mother. Norman Rockwell painted himself into this picture, as well as his friend, Grandma Moses over here. This is him celebrating Grandma Moses's birthday, but there's always a little bit of humor. And here, this young man who's returning home is, he's got the stuffed suitcase, presumably filled with dirty laundry, right? Some reunions are romantic reunions. This painting from 1945 at the end of World War II, I think sort of is like the precursor to today's Hallmark Christmas movies with, well, there's a lot of smooching here. So I'll zero in on some of the details. We've got Santa raising money here. We see him from behind. We've got various holiday shoppers with trees and wreaths and packages, but there are people smooching, returning GIs everywhere throughout this picture. Here's just one more detail. Oh, here they are again and again. So the holidays are about reconnecting with loved ones in a variety of forms. So I'll just end this section with an image where reunions aren't a possibility. And in this case, this picture from World War I called They Remembered Me shows that sometimes just a simple care package or a letter can provide that sense of closeness that is I think so many people are searching for at this time of year. So a soldier who is fighting abroad, in this case, gets the care package around the time of the holidays and smiles directly out at us with this feeling of just being loved from afar. It's a wonderful image. We have just a few images of celebration. Once everybody's together, what happens? For Norman Rockwell, a celebration sometimes involves a soda. So he did actually do one commercial for Coca-Cola. I apologize for the resolution over here, but we have the great detail where we see sort of Santa in reverie, just sort of pausing in his work to enjoy a Coca-Cola. And it's just this tiny little glass, and he's got this sweet smile on his face. Actually, the cat looks maybe even a little bit more happy than he is. But in 1966, Norman Rockwell gets to do a Pepsi ad. And look at how overwhelmingly happy his Santa is here. He is dancing, his feet are up in the air, he's leaning back. In fact, the response to this was like, Santa's got to have a little bit of rum in that Pepsi right there. He's having so much fun. Celebration can look like a glittering party, like we see over here with the little girl looking downstairs at the Christmas party. This was an image that Norman Rockwell did in 1964. And it reminds me, I think it reminds everybody of what it feels like to be a child and how it feels to see adults kind of coming together around the holidays and sort of wanting to be a part of that, finding it so fascinating. There's a real poignancy to an image like this. And of course, it's yet another kid who can't stay in their bed right around the time of the holidays. Here's another image of celebrating a father and a daughter. In this case, he's making music and she's dancing with the dog. This is another card for Hallmark. We've got dancing animals and animals making music. Here's a great photograph of Norman Rockwell trying to pose the dog for this picture. Sometimes the celebrating, sometimes the toys are more fun for the adults than they are for the kids. So in this early cover of the Saturday Evening Post, we've got Grandpa on the rocking horse with the little boy who's all dressed up like a cowboy. Grandpa might be having more fun than he is. I promised more pens. These are more advertisements for pens. In this case, Parker pens from 1961. And I get such a kick out of this picture over here on the left, because it's called They Gave Each Other a Parker / Fair Exchange. Now, I can promise you this girl wanted a ring, but here they are standing under the mistletoe, and they've embraced, and they're examining their pens that they both gave each other with absolute delight. And of course, over here, the little girl gave her father pens, and he couldn't be more pleased. Rockwell also did some advertisements for Milky Way a little bit later on in his career. Here we have a boy who's daydreaming as he opens up his stocking, and it looks like the dog is going in for a bite of his chocolate. Another little boy with a Milky Way, he's trying to coax a kiss out of this little girl with his mistletoe, looking very devilish with the kind of sculpted horns in his red hair. And he's thinking, if the mistletoe doesn't work, then certainly the chocolate will. I love this picture of another couple under mistletoe here, but it's an older couple just looking at each other with all the love and admiration in the world. These are two people that have no doubt been celebrating with each other for many decades, and it's still so wonderful to see this kind of affection in their faces. Rockwell updates this motif in the 1970s with a husband who's stealing a smooch from his bride over here. So we'll wrap up with just a couple of images of exhaustion, because we certainly know that the holidays can take a lot out of us. And so most of us probably feel this way once Christmas is done, right? Just the way Kris Kringle feels after he's gone around the world and delivered all those presents. Santa looks absolutely knocked out here. He's taken off his boots, he's stretching out. He looks an awful lot like that sales girl that we saw earlier on from 1947. Here's just another depiction of Santa after that big ride. He's ready for a nice long nap. He's taken off his boots and he's got these great green socks over here. Now, the end of the holidays are exhausting for everybody. There's a lot of meltdowns. If you've got a lot of kids in your life, I know all too well. So here's a little one who's crying as they head back to school. Their toy's already broken, the tree's knocked down. Somehow this picture always reminds me of the the line from the carol, and mom and dad can hardly wait for school to start again. So we will end on an uplifting note for today. We'll end with the golden rule once again, just this reminder that amidst all of the decoration, the preparation, the anticipation, the most important thing going forward over the next few weeks and into the next year is how we treat each other and allowing a little more grace for others in our lives. I will end there for now. I wish you all a Merry Christmas, and I welcome any questions or comments that you have about the images we looked at today. I'll start going through the chat here too.
Yeah, Jane, wonderful job as expected. Jane, would you like me to read the questions to you, or do you want to read the questions aloud?
I can start reading these aloud. Thank you. Oh, Eileen says, a scrawny tree might be synonymous with the economy. Adults in the 1950s lived through the Great Depression. Just a thought. Oh, Eileen, that's a really interesting idea. I always thought that it sort of went along with like fashion, like wardrobes too. So, but I'm sure it was driven by the economy and maybe by people who were thinking, you know, you have to be a little bit more scrappy about certain things. So that's an interesting insight. Thank you for sharing it. Karen says, oh, I think at the time the Red Line Inn, which we saw in that image of Stockbridge, which was dark. And I questioned as to why. And she says, maybe it was seasonal, which I think you're probably right on the money there. Otherwise, there's not a great explanation for it there. Elena says, I love the comparison of the sales girl to the Raggedy Ann doll. Regarding the massive Santa, obesity was a rarity in years past, so he was really unusual. Yeah, that giant red Santa that we saw before, he certainly stands out, doesn't he? This is the first time I recall seeing a halo above Santa's head. Significance. Okay, June, great question. There were a lot of Santas with halos in this presentation. And that is because, of course, he is Kris Kringle. Sometimes it's like a compositional device, and sometimes it's really intentional on the part of the artist. So he's Saint Nick is what I meant to say. So I think that's the reference there. And it seems as though Norman Rockwell sort of goes back and forth between whether or not he does it, but I think he's always trying to make him look like an interesting figure, add more to him visually. So I think it's like a fun device for him to use. Thank you for pointing that out, June. And then Cindy says, this is not Christmas, but Rockwell posing the dog reminded me of this. Is there truth to the story that he nailed through the webbing of a duck's feet to the floor in order to garner a pose? Cindy, you are not the first person to ask me about this, but I've never looked into it. I would find this really hard to believe. It's so dark. It doesn't seem to align with who he was as a person. But if somebody knows better about that than me, please let me know. And of course, I'm going to look into this now that I've been asked about it twice. Ooh, seems awful, doesn't it? I mean, if he's willing to try and pose a dog, it doesn't seem to me that he would go that far to get a duck to stand still. Rosamond, thank you for your kind words and for your familiar presence and by Zoom. So thanks for being here. Thank you everybody for these kind words. Let's just see, make sure I'm not missing any questions or comments. Eleanor, good to see you here today. He used a couple of different signatures. Can you elaborate? I don't know how much I can say about this, but he was very aware of sort of the stylistic impact of these different signatures. So I think these signatures would change depending on the kind of painting that he was creating. I should look into that a little bit more, but his signatures are very recognizable, even though they do change significantly during his career. So I'm glad you noticed that, Eleanor. I wish I had more to elaborate on it, but I think oftentimes he was trying to create something that was sort of in line with the times, really, and what he was creating. So I'll have to dig into that a little bit more. Bonnie says, this presentation was absolutely delightful. Thank you so much, Bonnie. I'm really glad you enjoyed it. And thank you everybody for all of these kind words. I really, really appreciate it. And I think that's most of it. Yes. Oh my goodness. Everybody, thank you so much for these kind words. You've just made my day. Absolutely.
And Jane, did you get the questions in the Q&A already? Did you
No, I
got through
have
most?
not. Sorry. Okay.
Yeah. And if you don't get to all 10, that's fine, but
Okay.
do your best.
Okay, so Margaret asked Rockwell, fine artist or illustrator? Really, the way you slice the difference there is because he was making finished oil paintings, highly detailed finished oil paintings, like a fine art artist, but he was doing them on commission for commercial purposes. That's what makes him an illustrator. He was fine with the term illustrator. It never sort of chafed him the way it did like N.C. Wyeth or somebody like that. So he was technically an illustrator, but I think art historians are appreciating his work in new ways in recent decades that really give him more credibility as a fine art artist. I think that answers that. Joyce asks, is it an important distinction when describing Rockwell as an illustrator? Okay, so I think we got to that. Mary says, in the Harried Salesgirl, her watch is right side up for someone standing in front of her. Usually those watches on a brooch were upside down, so the clock was right side up for the woman wearing it. Mary, what a great comment. Great thing to think about. So the watch was really for the benefit of other people in this context, like, hello, we're closing soon. So she could show people front and center what time it was, as opposed to being able to look down and easily check the time. Did Rockwell always use live models to photograph or sketch first, or did he sometimes use memory only? He was really methodical, Elena. Great question. Photography was really essential to his process. I'm not sure if that was true at the very early stages in his career, but certainly by the 1940s and the 1950s, it was an essential part of his process. And he would take anywhere from 50 to 100 photographs of his models, so much so that art historians today sort of imagine that if he were alive today, he might have been like a movie director because he was so specific, and he worked as like a director in terms of getting his models to achieve a certain pose and posture. So you have movie directors like George Lucas and Steven Spielberg who are really interested in collecting Norman Rockwell's artwork. Pat says, are these pictures at the Norman Rockwell Museum in Central Mass? Not all of them. Norman Rockwell gave a lot of his paintings away to his models. So they have a great collection there. It's probably the best collection of Norman Rockwell works, but they're not all there, unfortunately. Thank you for your kind words, Mira. Song I Saw, Mommy Kissing Santa Claus, was released in 1952. Okay, so that was probably the inspiration. Rena, thank you so much for sharing that. That was the little boy who saw the smooch. I forget where that was in the presentation, but you probably remember it. Does Hallmark still sell these vintage cards? Great question, Joyce. I am not sure about that. I actually have right next to me a pack of Norman Rockwell holiday cards, but I bought them through the museum. So I'm not sure if Hallmark does, but you can certainly find a lot of them around. What kind of training did Norman Rockwell have? He had a formal training as an artist. So he went to the National Academy of Design and attended the Art Students League. So he was studying art in the same way that a lot of other successful fine art artists were studying in the 20th century. Claudia, thanks for your comment. And then Mary says, in the triple self-portrait, is he sitting in red paint? Oh, that's a great question. We might have to go back to that. He might, let's see. Oh, that's actually a little cushion on his chair. But what's so great, and this painting is at the Norman Rockwell Museum, and I had just the absolute delight of standing up close and personal with it a few months ago. And one of the details here is that he has painted fingerprints kind of all over his wallet and the back of his belt. So you can tell he's just somebody with sort of dirty fingers who's getting it all over himself. Although if you go to his studio, which is also there on the grounds of the museum, he was actually fastidious in his process. His brushes were perfectly cleaned at the end of every painting session. So this is probably sort of a goofier take than actual reality for him. Great questions. Thank you again, everybody, for all of these wonderful questions, for your attention, for your very kind words. You've made my day. I wish you the happiest of holidays.
Yeah, so thank you, Jane. Wonderful job as always. Folks, look for an email from me later today with a link to this recording, a link to a feedback survey, and information about some other upcoming virtual holiday programs that we have planned this month. And I have good news and bad news. The bad news is we won't see Jane again till February. But the good news is it's February 2nd. So we're going to start off February on a high note. So we will see Jane once again in, I think, 7 weeks or so. But I'm going to let anticipation build for this one, Jane, okay? So Jane, we won't see you. So have a Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, Happy New Year. And that goes to you, Jane, and also everyone else on the line who I may not see before then. And yeah, I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. So thanks so much, Jane.
My pleasure. Merry Christmas, everyone. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.